The constraint was correct when it was written. The business rule it reflected was accurate, agreed upon, and documented. By the time the constraint ran against the data, the business had changed and the constraint had not. Most conversations about database constraints treat them as static objects. You define a rule, the database enforces it, and the system is safer for it. What this framing misses is that constraints encode assumptions about the world at a specific point in time. The world changes. Constraints do not change automatically. And a constraint that was precisely right at the moment it was written can become precisely wrong 12 months later, still running, still enforcing, but enforcing a rule that no longer reflects reality. Think about a speed limit on a road through a small town. When the limit was set, the road ran past a school on one side and open farmland on the other. The limit was set at 30 miles per hour, appropriate for the pedestrian activity, the sightlines, the traffic volume. 10 years later, the farmland is a housing estate. The traffic volume has tripled. The sightlines have changed. The school has moved. The speed limit is still 30. Whether that limit is now too high, too low, or still appropriate depends on the new conditions, but the limit itself does not know conditions have changed. It enforces the original judgment, applied to a road that is no longer the same road. A database constraint is a speed limit written into infrastructure. It enforces the judgment made at the time it was set, regardless of whether that judgment still fits. In 2018, a UK-based healthcare staffing platform built a constraint into their shift scheduling system. The rule was straightforward. A staff member could not be booked for more than 48 hours of shifts in any rolling 7-day period, reflecting the working time regulations limit. The constraint was encoded directly in the database as a check against a calculated weekly hours field. For 3 years, it worked correctly. In 2021, regulatory guidance for certain clinical settings was updated to allow opt-out agreements that permitted extended hours under specific contractual conditions. The platform's operations team began onboarding staff members who held valid opt-out agreements. The constraint did not know about opt-out agreements. It knew one rule: 48 hours maximum. Every attempt to schedule an opted-out staff member beyond 48 hours was rejected by the database. The operations team, unaware the rule was enforced at the database level and not just in the interface, concluded the system had a bug. They raised tickets. The development team investigated. 6 weeks passed before the constraint was identified as the source of the rejection. During those 6 weeks, approximately 1,100 eligible shifts for opted-out staff were either left unfilled or filled by agency workers at a significantly higher cost. The staffing shortfall in those clinical settings was real and operationally significant. The constraint had been exactly right in 2018. By 2021, it was enforcing a rule the business had legitimately moved beyond. The constraint did not fail. It performed precisely as designed. The design had simply not been updated to reflect a changed world. This is the specific risk of constraints that encode business rules rather than structural facts. A not null constraint on a primary key reflects a structural truth that does not change. Every record needs an identifier. A check constraint that enforces a regulatory limit, a pricing boundary, a geographic restriction, or an operational policy reflects a business judgment that was true at a specific moment. Business judgments change, structural truths do not. Mixing them in the same enforcement layer, without distinguishing between them, means that business rule changes, which go through a product or operations process, can be silently blocked by database constraints that nobody thought to update because nobody knew they needed to. There are 3 things that address this. First, separate structural constraints from business rule constraints in your schema and in your documentation. A constraint on a primary key is permanent. A constraint that encodes a regulatory threshold, a pricing policy, or an operational limit is time-bound. Tagging business rule constraints clearly, with the source of the rule, the date it was added, and a review owner, creates the visibility needed to catch them when the underlying rule changes. A constraint with no owner and no source is a constraint nobody will think to update. Second, build a constraint review step into your business rule change process. When a product manager updates a pricing policy, when an operations team onboards a new contract type, when a legal team confirms a regulatory change, the question should be explicit: does this change affect any database constraint? That question does not get asked automatically. It needs to be part of the change process, a checklist item, a sign-off, a conversation between the business and the technical team. The 2021 opt-out onboarding at the staffing platform went through an operational approval process. Nobody in that process thought to ask whether the database had an opinion. Third, treat the gap between a business rule change and its corresponding constraint update as a live risk. If a business rule changes and the constraint cannot be updated immediately, the constraint needs to be suspended with a documented re-enable plan, not left running as an increasingly inaccurate version of reality. A constraint that enforces the wrong rule is not better than no constraint. It is actively misleading. It tells the database that the old rule is still the rule, while the business operates as if it is not. The speed limit on the road through the town does not update itself when the housing estate is built. The engineers who set the limit are not watching for developments that might change the conditions it was designed for. Someone has to notice that the world has changed, connect that change to the limit, and initiate a review. In a database, that connection does not happen on its own either. A constraint has no awareness of the business context that produced it. It enforces its rule until someone updates it, or until the damage from enforcing the wrong rule becomes visible enough to investigate. Every constraint that encodes a business rule is a judgment from the past applied to the present. Most of the time, that judgment still holds, but the systems that fail are the ones that assume it always will, that treat a constraint written at a specific moment as a permanent truth, rather than a snapshot of what was understood to be true on the day someone wrote it down.